Hello everyone. This lecture is titled The Effects of Early Stimulation and Deprivation, and some objectives for today. Hopefully by the end of this lecture and listening to me talk about this content and reading the notes, you'll be able to describe some of the effects of early stimulation. You'll be able to describe some programs to enhance early motor development. You'll be able to describe and have a better understanding of McGraw's famous twin study involving early stimulation and deprivation. You'll understand some of the effects of early deprivation and explain some of the major concepts concerning stimulation and deprivation. So we're talking about infants, young children, and providing them with early stimulation opportunities, and also what happens when we deprive infants of these opportunities. So we're thinking about giving kids flashcards as soon as they're born, early math skills, giving young children under a year of age swimming opportunities, teaching them how to play the violin at a young age, karate, gymnastics, foreign languages. All of these ideas about providing early stimulation to infants. So when we talk about infants, we're talking about mainly from birth through 4 years of age, definitely in these preschool years. And I want you to think about concepts, or I don't know if any of you have read that famous article from several years ago called Bringing Up Super Baby, which documented this rush that parents were going through to try and provide their children with all these early opportunities, with the concept or this belief that's out there that kindergarten is too late, and if children haven't started on these skills at a younger age, then they're already behind. So it's particularly looking at these first 3 years of life and maybe asking the question, are all these programs that are out there worth the financial cost? So like I said, there's this societal belief that earlier is better, and that the trend has become so ingrained in many sectors of society that the common philosophy now states that it's never too early to start children in reading, math, swimming, violin, or karate lessons. So we'll look at that and look at what evidence is out there to either support this or to not support this. And some of you might have had experiences with this. I certainly have with my daughter, in terms of programs that we've put her in and what I think the benefits that she's received out of those programs are. So some questions that we might ask throughout this: is stimulation always good and deprivation always bad? Are there certain times where stimulation is good and certain times when deprivation is very bad? And is it worthwhile for the acquisitions of all human behaviors? And are there some behaviors that cannot be facilitated by early exposure to these stimulating experiences? And how do we know what we know? What research is out there to guide us in having an informed opinion on these issues? So, to jump in, looking at the effects of early stimulation, some of the research that I read talked about the prevalence of early stimulation programs. In 2013, 70% of 4-year-old children from families with incomes higher than $70,000 per year attended preschool. And preschool is a form of early stimulation because it's not required. Families are choosing to put the children into those programs. And for families with income lower than $35,000 a year, you can see that that number jumps down to 35%. So obviously, parents who have a higher disposable income are making the decision to use that money to provide these early stimulation programming opportunities for their children. So parents do believe that early educational stimulation is valuable in terms of cognitive development and what we're interested in, their motor development. However, some experts do believe that too early stimulation towards a skill like reading or other motor skills can actually cause difficulties later in those skills, such as reading. So there's definitely experts on both sides of this argument in terms of for and against. And if you really want to get into this, I would suggest you read the books by Glenn Doman, who was one of the first proponents of initiating instruction by using flashcards during the first few days of life. So he's been really for this early stimulation, as opposed to child developmentalists such as Benjamin Spock, who have stated that children may be over-intellectualizing and stated that this can actually hurt their later development. So though many new programs of early motor stimulation have evolved in recent years, few have gained the attention and popularity of this organization called Gymboree. And we don't see much of Gymboree on the East Coast, but it's very, very popular on the West Coast and in those states on that side of the country. So Gymboree, their philosophy assumes that preschoolers need to be provided with certain types of play activities that are believed to be essential to their development but are not readily available at home on the playground or in the nursery. So these are kind of like gymnasium settings with lots of equipment, and they started in 1976 with the first one, and then by 2010 there were 430 of them across the country. So like I said, their philosophy is stated again on this slide. The program generally lasts 9 to 13 weeks, with the child attending one time per week for a 45-minute session, each session costing around $15. The sessions offer scaled down equipment for children to explore with varying degrees of guidance from their parents. A Gymboree center often has balance beams, balls, scooters, tunnels, rollers, hoops, and ladders that are available for the children to play with during their free time. So lofty claims they're not really made by Gymboree, and I think they recognize that there's no controlled research to suggest that this program is superior to a no program or children who don't attend in terms of their motor development. And I'm curious, and I can't listen to your responses to this, but I would wonder how you would investigate the effectiveness of programs like Gymboree on children's motor development. Do these programs help them develop these skills? The research that has been done usually by self-report measures. So to assess the outcome of their programs, Gymboree surveys their parents and claims that parents report benefits for themselves and their children. Specifically, parents have cited increases in undistracted quality time with their children. They also appear to appreciate the opportunity to meet other families and exchange ideas. They further claim that their children often appeared less passive and dependent and developed better coordination and social skills after participating in a Gymboree program. However, like I said, little research exists to substantiate the claims made by Gymboree and other programs such as them. Self-evaluations, self-reports must be viewed cautiously, as there is an obvious bias on the part of the evaluator. So until controlled research is conducted, we shall not know whether these types of programs attain their goals or whether their participants are simply developing skills that are a normal part of the developmental process. As a parent, I would just add that sometimes when you send your children to these kind of programs, you're not that worried if research shows whether they help them improve motor skills. As a parent, you just want to see your kids smiling, having fun in a safe environment. For years, one of the most common forms of early motor stimulation has been swim programs for infants and preschoolers. For infants, birth to 1 year in particular, there may be little justification for the programs designed to teach infants to swim. And a lot of the research I read was pretty firm on that it's not really necessary to start kids in swim programs before a certain age. So these swim programs, some profess to teach infants how to swim, others claim to drown-proof infants, which obviously common sense says that's a really dangerous statement to make. The leading organization of pediatrics, which is the American Academy of Pediatrics, state that infant and toddler aquatic programs do not actually decrease the risk of drowning, and that children are not really ready for swimming lessons until their 4th birthday. So they state that beginning lessons for children at younger ages does not lead to a more rapid mastery of a skill or an eventual higher level mastery of swimming skills. Another health consideration with early aquatic programs, especially those involving infants, is the condition known as hypernatremia. Some of you may have heard of this. It's also known as water intoxication. This occurs when an individual ingests so much water that the body's electrolytes are reduced and the kidneys cannot filter the excess fluid. This becomes a concern in those programs that practice forced or frequent submissions or are particularly long. For these reasons, parents should be advised to monitor the quantity of water consumed by their children before, during, and after participation in a water program. A sad case, an example of hypernatremia was a condition of an 11-month-old infant who swallowed more water than usual during an infant swim lesson. Though she experienced no problems while in the pool, 30 minutes after leaving the water she became irritable, lethargic, and disoriented. She also vomited while going to the hospital and began having seizures once she arrived. The excess water consumption is believed to reduce serum sodium levels, causing the symptoms just described, and also restlessness, weakness, and in severe cases, death. Another issue with swim programs is Giardia, I believe I'm saying that correctly, which is a parasitic condition which develops due to cyst growth in the digestive tract. This parasite can cause severe diarrhea and is easily transmitted to others when the cysts circulate throughout the pool. So this is another danger of swim programs. And when I do show this in the class, this is my segue to showing the clip from, I'm drawing a blank at the name of the movie now. Caddyshack, maybe, in the swimming pool. Anyway, so let's talk about some possible benefits of early swim programs. Research has shown that they do provide an affection for water at a young age. It does provide a unique environment for parent-child interactions. The feeling in the water can be comforting for the children. However, we do need to recognize that supportive data are lacking in terms of showing the benefits of these early swim programs for helping children actually learn the motor skill of swimming earlier than those who kids don't engage in swimming. The American Academy of Pediatrics does recommend that swim programs adopt certain guidelines. They do state that children are not ready for formal swim lessons until their 4th birthday, which is interesting because I'm sure you've known, as do I, many people who put their kids in swim lessons before they're 4. They say that we should avoid total submersion. We should provide measures for avoiding fecal contamination in the pool, and that children should never be dropped or pushed into the water. Again, this isn't a group of very conservative parents making these kind of statements. This is the American Academy of Pediatrics, who are a national organization of pediatric doctors who are making these kind of statements. Also, we should recognize that babies chill easily, so we should limit their exposure or amount of time in the water. Head Start program. Some of you may have experienced or heard of Head Start programs. This is an early stimulation program. This was started in 1965 by President Johnson on his war on poverty. And this was to give financially disadvantaged children a head start in education, to recognize that we needed to disrupt a cycle that had become apparent in education, with disadvantaged children falling further and further behind with each school year. So this Head Start program was started in 1965, so it is a form of early stimulation. And here's some information that I just read to you. The major goal of the Head Start program was to enhance the social competence of children from lower income families. And they defined social competence as the ability to deal with the present environment in school and for life. So just being able to handle the demands of being in school when they got to that point. These programs, a lot of research done on them, obviously, because there was a lot of federal dollars behind these. The children of Head Start programs were 10 times more likely to complete a high school education without failing out compared to their socio-economic counterparts. So obviously that's very profound. 10 times more likely to complete high school education. A DC study reported that programs like Head Start and other preschool programs affected children's long-term performance positively. I'm going to skip this slide. It was another study on Head Start programs, said the same thing. Very positive. The downside to the Head Start program is the financial cost. In 2012, which is the latest time I could find data, it was costing $9,000 a year to finance this program, which obviously is paid for by taxes. So there's obviously political issues tied to whether you would feel this is a good program or whether it's not a good program. Some of the more interesting research on early stimulation is involved looking at infant walkers, which an example you can see on the picture on this slide. They're designed to support babies who cannot yet walk independently, and they've been around for centuries in different kinds of formats. And annual sales of these exceed 3 million, so they're very, very popular. They allow the infant feet to touch the floor, permitting some mobility while the infant learns to walk. And they're often equipped with built-in toys, bouncy stuff, colorful stuff, and things that visually stimulate the infant. So they're designed for babies who cannot walk independently. However, there are many questions about the safety and efficacy of the device to promote early walking. Are they just fun for the infant, or do they actually promote the motor skill of walking? So, this is interesting. This is coming again from the American Academy of Pediatrics, who have looked at the research and deal with children who have problems in walkers, and they say due to the risk and lack of clear benefit, the sale and manufacturers of infant walkers should be banned in the US. Well, that's a really profound statement. And that parents need to be informed of the dangers of a walker, and childcare centers should not allow the use of walkers. And a lot of this surrounds the kind of old school design. You can see on this walker here, there's wheels. So a lot of the dangers involve the infant being able to move around and maybe fall down stairs or get into areas and be able to grab things that they wouldn't be if they weren't in the walker. So lots of research done on these walkers, and I'm presenting the one side of the argument that shows that it's dangerous. So for example, some research has shown how that 34 infants died in walker-related deaths between 1973 and 1998, and that there were 200,000 injuries during this time period. However, despite this controversy, parents cite many benefits to the use of walkers, although there's no data to actually support that. Parents state that walkers are appealing for their value as a babysitter. However, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, they do not appear to keep babies safe. In addition, claims that they facilitate walking development are unfounded. Studies indicate that they may delay the onset of independent walking while impeding crawling development. And there's few benefits seem to derive from walkers beyond parents' beliefs that their babies often seem more content in the walker. So the research is shown that actually could hinder the development of future motor skills. Back in 1935, Myrtle McGraw conducted what is now considered a classic investigation directly concerning motor development and the effects of early stimulation. And some of you may have heard of this twin study before. In her research, McGraw closely monitored the twin brothers known as Johnny and Jimmy, and she was particularly interested in determining if a child's normal progress in motor development could be altered by given conditions. Therefore, for the first 22 months of the twins' lives, McGraw gave Johnny toys and considerable stimulation, practice, and experience in a variety of movement activities. Jimmy, however, had few toys and minimal motor stimulation. So Johnny was provided stimulation and Jimmy wasn't. McGraw periodically examined the effects of the varying levels of stimulation by exposing the twins to selected movement activities. For example, Johnny was given a tricycle when he was 11 months old. He was also given considerable practice and some instruction at that time. However, McGraw noted that 8 months elapsed before Johnny showed any signs of learning on the tricycle. Then he proceeded to master tricycling quickly within 2 months. Jimmy was deprived of tricycling until he was 22 months old. However, despite his relatively low level of stimulation, he learned tricycling much faster than Johnny. This led McGraw to conclude that a certain level of readiness is necessary for the acquisition of a motor skill. Jimmy was ready to tricycle at 22 months, but Johnny was not ready at 11 months. And this continues on where she looked at other types of motor skills and compared their development over time. And there's actually some really cool YouTube videos on Jimmy and Johnny if you want to go ahead and just Google Jimmy and Johnny. So she continued to look at their development over time, and even though certain motor skills didn't emerge quicker with the more experience and early exposure, over the course of the study, McGraw did find that Johnny was favored more socially, was less aggressive, was less dependent on the mother, was more emotionally mature, self-centered and dependent, and more impersonal, self-confident, and brave. We do need to recognize, though, that McGraw's longitudinal investigation of Johnny and Jimmy was in many respects somewhat unscientific. With only 2 main subjects in her investigation, we might assume that the experiences of Johnny and Jimmy were not indicative of what would happen with other subjects at a similar age. Nevertheless, McGraw is frequently credited with having an astute and insightful ability for determining possible explanations for the difference in movement behavior between Johnny and Jimmy. The effects of early forms of deprivation are important to developmentalists studying all aspects of human behavior. The type, length, time, and severity of deprivation and its subsequent effects are all variables that they strive to understand. So when we look at deprivation, we're talking about children being deprived of certain activities and movement opportunities that other children in normal situations were not deprived of, and then looking at the effect of this over time. In the 1930s, Wayne Dennis extensively studied the Hopi tribe. Much of this work culminated with the publication of his book, The Hopi Child. Of particular interest for motor development was, for us, looking at motor development, was his description of the use of the infant cradle boards used by the Hopis. As young as 1 month old and until their first birthday, babies were swaddled and tied to a board. The baby's arms were usually extended at the sides with only enough rope for a slight bend. The legs were also placed in an extended position. Generally, according to Dennis, while on the board, the Hopi infant was prevented from doing many movements that would be typical of babies who were not cradled. For example, they couldn't touch their hands to the mouth, they couldn't wash their hands or kick their feet. They were also seldomly taken from their home until about 4 months of age, and when they were taken out, they were usually carried in the arms of the mother or on her back while the cradle board was left at home. And so you can see the picture of this cradle board on this slide right here. Sorry, I jumped a little bit quickly there. So they spent up to 23 hours a day on this cradle board up to 1 year of age. As Dennis noted in his book, questions arose concerning the effect of using the cradle board on the baby's development. Dennis maintained that during the first few months of life, the Hopi babies still assumed a flexed position when temporarily freed from the board. They also exhibited several other activities expected from babies not using a cradle board. For example, they would play with their feet and hands. In fact, the sequence of acquisition of many voluntary movement skills seemed to follow the sequence that would normally occur without the deprivation of the cradle board. According to Dennis, Hopi infants developed such skills as sitting, creeping, and walking in the usual sequence and at the same time as the non-cradle board white American children. So this seemed to have no effect on the motor development of these children, even though they were tied down on a board pretty much for their first year of life. The effects of early emotional or social deprivation are much more pervasive than were once expected. For example, infants hospitalized by a long period frequently become listless, apathetic, and depressed. Even more surprising is that infants under extended hospital care in unstimulated environments often fail to gain weight and may develop respiratory infections and fever. This condition, known as deprivation dwarfism, can have a permanent impact on the individual. So deprivation dwarfism is a situation where we have a negative influence on human growth and motor development caused by serious deprivation. This causes an emotional disturbance that is registered in the higher centers of the brain, leads to problems with the release of the growth hormone somatotropin, which leads to the dwarfism. And when this growth is affected, the motor development may also be affected. And then we need to look at a phenomenon called catch-up. An example of this developmental dwarfism situation can be described in a case study of a girl called Anna. And this came out of the 1950s and was described by Kingsley Davis as one of the most tragic of all reported cases of early deprivation. Anna was isolated in an attic-like room in her home with minimal stimulation of any kind for almost the first 6 years of her life. She was an illegitimate child who resided with her mother and grandfather, and she was an unwitting victim of a family dispute. Her grandfather opposed having her in the home, while the mother argued in favor of her staying. The compromise led to Anna staying in the house but living in the attic from the age of 5.5 months to 6 years of age. In the attic, Anna received minimal care, barely enough to maintain her existence. When Anna was eventually discovered, she was in terrible condition. She showed minimal signs of intelligence, could not walk or talk, and was extremely malnourished. Davis described her legs as being skeleton-like and her abdomen bloated. Upon discovery, Anna was taken to a county home. During her stay at that institution, she showed minimal signs of improvement. She had developed with motor skills somewhat, and she could eat by herself and was able to walk. Her speech and intellectual abilities were severely impaired. Approximately 2 years after being discovered in the attic, Anna was taken to a private home for children with retardation. There she continued to progress, although slowly. Her prognosis was described as unfavorable because she still showed no signs of speech other than random guttural sounds. Davis further described Anna as having an extremely poor attention span, periodically making non-purposeful rhythmical movements and watching her hands as if she'd seen them for the first time. When Anna was 8 years old, she was examined by a clinical psychologist who found that her vision and hearing were normal, and she showed progressing motor ability as she began to climb stairs. Her speech was in the babbling stage, and her mental age was determined as approximately 19 months. Her social maturity was judged roughly equivalent to a typical 23-month-old child. The examining psychologist predicted that Anna would eventually achieve the mental ability of a 6 or 7-year-old. By the age of 9, Anna had progressed with her motor skills. She could bounce balls and socialize somewhat. She could eat with considerable control, although her eating was confined to the use of a spoon and an eating technique typical of a much younger child. Most surprisingly, Anna had begun to speak in occasional full sentences, but was still described as possessing the language abilities of a 2-year-old. When she was 10 years old, a final report on Anna revealed that she could string beads and build with blocks, showing evidence of progressing fine motor control. In addition, Anna walked and ran but was said to be rather clumsy. Her speech had evolved into frequent attempts at communication, although she rarely spoke in complete sentences. Unfortunately, Anna died at the age of 11. So this is an example of the tremendous effect that Anna's isolation and deprivation had on her. So the question would have been, how did her actual state differ from what she would have been like in normal circumstances? So 3 concepts to study on the last few slides of this lecture. The first concept relates to critical periods. And for years, experts have recognized that human development includes certain critical periods. These critical periods are times when specific conditions or stimuli are required for optimal or even normal development to ensure, or a developmental window during which specific experiences has a greater effect than at other times. If a child is exposed to the appropriate stimuli during this time of optimal sensitivity, a particular human behavior is likely to emerge or at least be facilitated. So it could be argued that Anna missed that critical period of language development. Readiness is the establishment of the minimal characteristics necessary for a particular human behavior to be acquired. It is often used in conjunction with the term critical period. As this definition implies, an ultimate form of readiness can be considered a critical period. However, this may be the case because readiness more commonly implies that the individual has become prepared or ready to acquire a certain or particular behavior. In other words, the person has reached a certain point in an ongoing process that has enabled the establishment of the minimal characteristics necessary for a particular movement skill or other human behavior to be acquired. Both stimulation and deprivation can have various effects on many aspects of human development. Depending on any number of variables, many of which are unknown, the effects vary from one situation to the next. For example, in cases of severe deprivation, one person may exhibit permanent behavioral damage, such as Anna, while another person exhibits only temporary effects. This may be due to the phenomenon known as catch-up. Catch-up is an ability to return to inherent growth trajectory after deviating from that path. And this inexplicable phenomenon occurs in response to severe deprivation or adverse treatment, such as what we discussed in the slides on deprivation dwarfism. Catch-up is evidence that the human being is capable of acquiring new behaviors or increasing physical growth more rapidly than during a period of recovery. One of the most interesting examples of catch-up involves Harlow's classic studies of monkeys. Harlow either totally or partially isolated the monkeys from any kind of social contact for either 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months. Although the total or partial isolation led to similar behavior patterns, the longer periods of isolation created much more devastating effects. The 3-month isolates appeared to be in a state of emotional shock when they were allowed to interact socially. They were fearful of other monkeys and avoided contact with them. This group of monkeys also exhibited abnormal behaviors of self-clutching, self-biting, rocking, and pulling their own hair. And despite these rather unusual behaviors, the monkeys eventually recovered when allowed to play daily with a group of normal-aged monkeys. So the 3-month-old monkeys had problems earlier on, but eventually recovered. The monkeys that were isolated for 6 months yielded a poorer prognosis. They exhibited the same behavior traits exhibited by the 3-month isolates, but this second group showed poorer ability to recover. They avoided their age mates during playtime and showing social interest only in the other isolates. As expected, the 12-month isolates exhibited even more behavioral abnormalities. Along with exhibiting the same characteristics as the other isolates, the 12-month group revealed greater apathy and were more severely withdrawn. They were extremely passive and defenseless to attacks from their normal age monkeys. Harlow and another colleague did a follow-up study for 26 weeks of therapy for the 3-month-old monkeys. They found that their social, emotional, intellectual, and motor development catch-up skills were evident, and they were able to get back on track as on the same trajectory as monkeys who had not been isolated. So this shows an example of human beings. It's a child's growth following a period of anorexia, and you could see the anorexia happens at a certain age, between 1 and 2 years of age, and you could see that they deviated away from the normal curve. However, after a period of time, they were able to catch back up onto that estimated growth curve. That concludes this lecture. We looked at stimulation and deprivation, and we looked at some programs for early education for children and recognized that they've become very popular in recent years. However, the value of many of these programs is unsubstantiated by research, controlled research. We also looked at Murdo-McGraw's study with Johnny and Jimmy, which yielded many valuable conclusions concerning the effects of early stimulation. McGraw concluded that readiness, practice, attitude, and physical growth are all particularly important factors that influence human movement at an early age. We looked at how early deprivation has a dramatic impact on early child development in all domains of human behavior, and how deprivation dwarfism is the retardation of physical growth following a period of severe deprivation. And then we define the terms critical period, which is a time of special sensitivity to environmental stimuli. The term readiness, that implies a person has achieved a certain point in an ongoing process where a certain behavior can be acquired. And then finally we looked at catch-up, which is the human being's ability to return to a predetermined pattern of behavior or growth following a period of deprivation. That concludes this lecture.